Friends, we are here with Jennifer Bangoura, Senior Career Coach at 2U. She has 10 years of experience at primary and higher education sectors worldwide, including a village of 1,000 people in Mali, West Africa, and coordinating career service training for over 250 staff and university in Iraq and Morocco. Did I leave anything out of your bio there?
I think that covers the professional side, yeah.
Excellent. Very exciting to talk with you because as a career coach, you're going to be giving advice that might well help many people who are listening to this to change their lives positively. So we have a lot of topics we can discuss, but I think we should just dive right in and talk about career transitions for people who are returning to the United States from time abroad. Could you talk a bit about your personal experience with that?
Sure thing. And I wanted to say too, thank you so much for having me. It's a real treat and honor to be here. My transition when I came back to the U.S. from my time in the Peace Corps was difficult to say the least. So I had been living in Mali for almost 4 years with the Peace Corps, the first two from the initial 27-month service. I did a third year. I came back to the U.S. and started my master's degree through SIT Graduate Institute, and then went back to Mali rather. And then, like all good plans, things changed quickly. There was a coup d'etat in 2012. I was recently engaged and needed to move back to the US, or I felt I did, to finish my master's and get a job with health insurance. So my transition looked like me applying to positions from a hotel room in Ghana during our evacuation, and frantically reaching out to people. I had a LinkedIn account, but at the time, this was in 2012, I really had not used it since I had finished undergrad. So I found a fellow volunteer who had come back when our initial service had ended and reached out to him about a job where he worked. And he said, I don't know about that job, but I'm leaving mine to pursue another career, and you speak French. So if you want to talk to my boss and see about applying for this job, I'll be happy to connect to you. And then a month later, I had that job.
That's great. So it sounds like you leaned heavily into the networking aspects that you got through the Peace Corps.
I did. And not only was my connection a fellow volunteer, but my new boss had also done the Peace Corps in Sub-Saharan Africa prior as well. So there was definitely, I leaned on my own immediate Peace Corps network, and then also the larger, broader network of someone who knew the kind of experience that I had and what he could expect in terms of an employee.
I'm really interested in the piece that you were talking about, where you're talking about some of the challenges in terms of maybe the technology or the time zone differences made it difficult to do some of the networking. Just from my own personal experience, there was one time where I was close by in Côte d'Ivoire, a little bit south of Mali, and I was trying to pitch a venture capitalist by Skype using the very slow connection in the hotel room that I was in. And he was so frustrated with the lag that he, said some expletives and hung up on me. And I was so incredibly frustrated at the time. But that being said, I think that, the downsides from that, that one particular incident were vastly outweighed by the perspectives that I gained from having had this unique experience. And, do you think that, directly or indirectly, some of these experiences in Mali contributed to kind of give you a different perspective or just even a different strength and application?
They did, and at the same time, and it's something that Peace Corps is great about in terms, like in our close of service, they do have a session, they call it close of COS or close of service workshop on networking and how to communicate your Peace Corps experience when you return. Now, this could apply to anybody who's translating your internationally, whether that be your study abroad or even travel abroad experience, because sometimes you forget, the uniqueness of it. Again, this could be applied to anyone applying for any job. How do you translate your time abroad into a domestic job search or any job search? And I've been talking with a friend who's moving from Ghana back to the US, and not only translating your experience, but you've been out of the US job market for 5-10 years, or maybe even things have changed since the last time you applied for a job. I had never applied for jobs in the United States because I left for the Peace Corps right 2 months after I had graduated undergrad. So this was my first time even venturing into the job search process. And I think that's what now I lean into as a career coach and working in workforce development, is calling on my own experience and what I felt like, and wanting to, remove that shroud of mystery for other people. At least that's what brings me, I think, joy in my work.
Excellent. So it sounds like on balance, you'd recommend the Peace Corps?
If I recommend the Peace Corps?
You're right, to young people maybe getting out of college?
I mean, I wouldn't say that everyone should do it, but I would say that if people are thinking about doing it or considering doing it, it's been the best decision I've made in my life. And I can say that because people will then say, well, what about meeting your partner? And I'll say, because I did the Peace Corps, I was able to meet my husband. So it was the best decision.
I feel terrible. We're actually shooting this on Valentine's Day, but it's not going to be released until after Valentine's Day. But how perfect would it have been to have on the Valentine's Day release?
I think you can bring the spirit of Valentine's Day into your job search and life every day. So that's what I try to do.
That's very good advice. So you covered a lot about the time abroad. What about the move from nonprofit to the private sector? I know this is something that's very important for a lot of people. What's your overall thoughts on this?
Mm-hmm. So after I came back from the Peace Corps, I was at World Resources Institute and I loved it. I'd recommend anyone to work there. And then I transitioned over to IREX. I had just recently finished my master's in international education. So IREX for me was my dream employer. And I loved working there as well and would recommend anyone to work there. And yet I felt this desire to better understand what it's like to work in the private sector. We are a publicly traded company, but and I was really intimidated about making that transition because I felt like I had carved out this niche of West Africa, North Africa, international development, career services, and so I thought, and granted, it wasn't like I was that late in my career, but even in my 30s, I felt like I didn't have the option to transition. So I started talking to other folks who had made that transition, connected with some alumni from my undergrad and other Peace Corps volunteers, just to see what their best practices had been. And I thought it was going to be vastly different. And yet what I would encourage anyone who's considering that transition is to really spend time. What I did was looked at the 2U website. I started to look at job descriptions, even though I wasn't applying, to think about, well, how's my experience in the nonprofit world? Would it translate to another company? And of course, I mean, now that I look back, I think like it's obvious that all skills are transferable, and it's really about owning your narrative and thinking. You have to be the one that proves and connects the dots for an employer and for yourself. So it hasn't been as big of a shift as I thought it would be. Yeah, that would be my advice.
You touched on it. When you talked about skills, is there actually a skills gap? Is there different skills that are used in nonprofit versus for-profit? Did you find that you had to do anything to kind of prove that, or do you find the skills are mostly the same?
So since it's Valentine's Day, and I do get this question, I think there's a parallel here. People will ask me, my husband is from West Africa, and they'll ask me, oh, how is it different being married to somebody who's not American? And I think the parallel is the same for like, okay, working in a nonprofit, working in private sector, like there is always no matter if you're going from nonprofit to nonprofit, private to private, you have to learn a new way to communicate. And just because my husband's from somewhere else, I'm from the South, if he was from the North or from West Coast, we would still have cultural differences, even if we're from the same culture. So no matter even if you're going to, I've just found that when now moving into a new company, you have to observe, listen, ask questions, find people who work in different departments to get your own institutional knowledge built up. I remember starting and thinking, what's the best practice? Do people reply all on all emails here? Something that I don't like to do, but I had noticed when I started, people were replying all on these emails. I said something that I should be doing. So noticing things that are different and calling them out, because then my boss at the time was like, no, you don't need to reply all. It's actually not the best practice we want. So that has been my experience, is to just be observant and ask questions.
Interesting. I know a lot of people who are transitioning from nonprofit to for-profit are really concerned about the social mission of the company. Is that something that factored into your career search, or not at all?
It's certainly factored into it. I want to work somewhere that I believe in the mission and the values, definitely. And I think that narrative or idea is not I don't know, you believe what you believe. But for me, that's my personal value, is to work somewhere that I believe in the work that I'm doing. And I 100% believe in what I'm doing here. And otherwise, if I didn't, I would choose to work somewhere else. So yes, that's a personal call that you need to make. But just because something's for profit or nonprofit, to me is not the line in the sand of like whether it's good or bad. Like you think about even in international development, there are private sector companies, Chemonics, Apt, another list, who are getting the same grants from USAID or State Department and doing not the same work, but doing the same kind of work. So they are similarly mission driven. And that just has to be something that for any company, whether it's nonprofit or private, again, I think you have to do your own due diligence and research. As a career coach, you have to do your informational interviews and find out, what the real inside scoop is about them. But for me, that was not something I would be willing to negotiate, and I haven't had to. Yeah.
That's great. Offhand, are there any resources that you use to help with this research?
Well, you start with the website, and if the website, 2U's website is very robust in terms of what you can find, and then even just Googling the name and looking in news, seeing where it's brought up, going onto Twitter and seeing where the mentions are happening, looking up the people who work there on LinkedIn. It's like you can't now find, oh, I didn't know that was out there, because there's so much information. Unless it's a startup and there's only one person that works there, even that one person probably has a LinkedIn account, so you can find out information. Yeah, it takes time though. I'll give you that. It's not that it's easy, but it does take time.
Yeah, it seems like social media really has transformed the landscape, hasn't it?
It has, and even just since the past, 10 years that I've been working full time, to think about going onto sites like The Muse, where they are doing these really incredible company profiles. It's not just an about section. The Muse has these 1-minute videos with different people who work there in different sectors or different departments within a company. You have hashtags for companies where you can, hashtag life at Airbnb, hashtag life at that, especially given the unemployment right now and how low it is and how it's really a job seekers market, and employers are trying to find great employees. They are doing so much more in their employer branding. So yeah, there's a lot out there on social media, especially.
And you talked just a few minutes ago about the informational interview. Did you actually do an informational interview to get into 2U or any of these other positions? It's something that we strongly advocate for.
Yes. So actually, for 2U, no, I did not. Ultimately, I did know one person who had worked here, but I didn't know her well, and the interview process was so quick, I didn't even reach out. For WRI, I talked with my friend who worked there. For IREX, I actually had been partnering with someone at IREX to host YALI, the Young African Leaders Initiative Fellows at WRI. And so I had a contact already there, and I worked with her. I said, hey, could you pass on my resume? And she had also done Peace Corps. She's like, yep, I'll pass on your resume to the person. She sits right next to me, who also had done Peace Corps, my future boss. So for the jobs that I have now, an informational interview did not maybe land me the job, but they have been what's helped fuel my success in the job. And if I can share, may I just share how or why?
Oh, please.
So, I imagine, and I usually encourage students to do an informational interview to learn about a company or an industry, but I actually also recommend them for how to do your job better. So when I started at IREX, for example, I had never worked in Morocco. I traveled there and had put that as part of in my cover letter, but I hadn't had a professional experience there. So I went onto LinkedIn and I searched Morocco, and then filtered for DC area and different things. And I started just having 30-minute phone interviews or coffee dates if they were in DC to learn about what their experience had been like working for a nonprofit in Morocco. And that was just to give me a better understanding of the landscape, any things I needed to be aware of culturally that I should think of when I'm working with our team there. So that's been really helpful for me.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. One thing that they taught us at MIT for the entrepreneurship classes was before you ever build anything, start talking with people and have
Mhm.
10, 20 conversations with potential customers, just
Yeah.
because you learn so much from the process of getting out and talking with people. And
Well, and I think too, it's when I was in my master's program at SIT, part of one of our assignments was to do an informational interview. And sometimes I'll talk with students and they're like, "What is an informational interview? I've never even heard of this." And I hadn't either when I did my first one in 2012. And I remember it was with Jason Kelleher. Someone at my job at WRI had connected me with him. He was at IIE at the time, and I was so nervous. I did my research, I put my questions. He generously, accepted to meet with me at his office. I think for 30 minutes, 45 minutes, and I'm leaving that information interview. I can still picture it, and I was just like, "Oh my gosh, I'm so energized right now. I feel so motivated. This is so fascinating." And I think too, that's now like why I get so excited about it in career coaching, because that was not something, and to do them when you don't need the informational interview feels so much better on both sides. So I wasn't desperate for a job at the time, and he didn't feel the pressure of like, this lady's meeting with me and just wants a job. So I always go back to that in my mind. And then there's so many others. I mean, I can't remember every information interview, but I can remember a lot.
yeah, they really stick out in your mind. Are there any particular best practices that you would recommend for people when they're requesting an informational interview?
Yes. And I have started sending this when I'm getting now requests to do them, since I wouldn't call them burns, but it's like when you get on the phone with somebody and they would say to you, like, "Well, tell me about res score." And you're like, I wish you had just Googled the name before, so I don't have to, spend 5 minutes of our conversation just telling you the basics about the company. So I would recommend going into these interviews and treating them as though they were an interview. So do your work beforehand to make it a rich conversation, to ask really specific questions. It's like you don't want to go in there to understand a general shell of what a company is like, or you want to go in and say, I understand the shell, I've done my research. Tell me, about this specific, I read about this specific project and I want to know, what was it challenging about working with X or Y or Z? And then that person can share a lot more interest and information that's going to actually give you a real insight into what it's like to work at that company or be an employee there.
Do you find it's best just to request by email, LinkedIn, phone? What's the best format you found?
So I'm definitely a pro of the double opt-in. If you are, hey, Garrett, could you connect me with Nick? And if I had a specific ask, I want Nick to help me design an online course, then I would, hope that you would, generously touch Nick. Hey, is it cool if I put you in touch with Jennifer? But so if that's one avenue, the second, if you're doing it on your own, which is what the vast majority of the informational interviews I do, I am just finding folks on LinkedIn or reading about them in a blog post or article. And I like to send a custom message when I personalize my invite on LinkedIn and make sure that I've looked something up. So, hey, Garrett, I saw that interview you did with Nick Martin. That was super interesting. I loved how you asked questions about X, Y, and Z. Delighted to connect here. No ask in your initial outreach. If then, you reply and say, "Oh, Jennifer, thanks so much. Really appreciate you watching that podcast that I put a lot of time and effort into, and I'm glad someone listened to it. Would be delighted to talk sometime, touch base." That happens to me a lot, and it's not because I think I'm special, but I don't think it's because I'm anyone special. It's because I'm putting time into my outreach and showing that I care and have done my research. And then you or someone would feel willing to like, hey, if you want to talk more, I'd love to. It gets them excited.
And do you usually have to bribe them with coffee?
Well, usually I'm not even meeting. I don't really remember the last informational interview I did in person. I'm just doing quick phone calls. I live in the DC area, but I don't work in DC proper. So even going into the city is like 45 minutes or an hour with transit and parking and so on. And so I always give the opt out. Hey, I know, Garrett, you've got a lot going on. So if now's not a good time, I'm just happy to connect once the connection is made. And I'd be happy talk, give that time bound. Hey, if you've got 20, 30 minutes, I'd love to connect. So it's like, I have had informational interviews where we get to the 30-minute mark, and in my mind, we're done. And they're like, yeah. And so then I want to keep going. I'm like, I don't have hours to talk. I mean, neither do they, but it's managing expectations, which you have to do a lot. So that's something else that I'm mindful of in my own requests is I don't want to take someone's entire day. I know they're busy.
Makes sense. Let's move to volunteerism, which has been a big thread throughout your entire career, obviously from the Peace Corps, but even up through the 3 volunteer days you get per year at TU. Could you talk some about the importance of volunteerism to the job search?
I can. I mean, yes. So doing the Peace Corps has transformed my life, and even going farther back, I mean, I was president of my Key Club in high school, and then in college volunteered throughout, and it's volunteering at a community garden, downtown Greens, in Fredericksburg, Virginia, when I was at Mary Washington, that put me in the environment category as a Peace Corps volunteer. And for me, volunteering, of course, it makes me feel good that I'm giving back to my community. And then it also keeps me honest to tap into what makes me happy, what brings me joy, and something that I'm not getting paid for. And so obviously it could be the task itself. So say I am I volunteer with my local community garden. I don't, but say I did. I'll give it a real example. I volunteered I was secretary for our police and public safety committee. The topic is interesting to me. I wanted to be connected to something bigger than myself in Hyattsville, where I live. But what I found on the committee that really brought me joy was being connected to other people in my community who I normally am not seeing on a day-to-day basis. So I loved having a pulse on what's happening in my community. I loved meeting people who are of all ages. So our committee, is from folks who are just graduating from University of Maryland and had done journalism degrees and were trying to get a local beat, to our, I won't say age, but our much older chairman who had a really fascinating career in the military and had worked in a lot of different areas in the police force. So to me, that just sparks different interests and areas that I want to dig into. And also gives you an opportunity to flex skills that you maybe aren't using in your day-to-day work. So as part of that, I did, I would post social media things about being on the committee, or it gave me the opportunity to connect with my council people and talk about other issues that were important to me. So yes, and I think too, I don't know if I share this with you, but I noticed when I moved to DC, it is such a transitional city, whether or not people are moving out of the entire city, but are changing jobs all the time. And I think there can be this mentality of like, well, I'm not going to be here for long. So I can't commit to something. I might be moving or so on. And yet I would recommend to people that there's always something, even if it's a short-term thing, that you can help out with, so there's always something you can be doing, and it can be overwhelming, and I recognize that. But I do think there is great value in volunteering from a personal and professional.
Absolutely. Yeah. It reminds me somewhat of the study. I can't remember the exact name of the study. I'll have to look this up afterwards, but basically finding that if you have people who have the same kind of overlapping connections, because they all tend to go to the same thing, so maybe the same industry events, versus someone who has the same size network, but it's more spread out across much different industries, many different people. It's that second network that tends to be the most powerful, because you have these kind of diffuse connections, and you can make connections across that you might not immediately think.
Totally. And I think too, what I struggle with a little bit is I am a career coach, so I think about jobs a lot. I think about the job search. I also live in Washington, D.C., so people are very ambitious and career focused. And so I don't want to come across to folks as like, you've got to be strategic in all things. And, when you're volunteering, you need to be thinking about like, how could this leverage to your career? And yet it's true. And these things can happen naturally, though, when you don't put pressure on them. So yes, I agree. That's definitely underlying, and I've seen that happen for friends, where even you're volunteering for an organization. A friend had this, and she wasn't looking for a job, but they were looking for someone with her skill set. She'd been volunteering with them for years, and then the opportunity came up. She still had to apply and get the job, but she had such a rich story and connection to that nonprofit, and then she ultimately ended up getting the job. So yeah.
I feel like I would characterize your take on volunteerism as being what I would call something with diffuse upsides. So it might directly benefit your job search, it might not, but that doesn't matter because there's so many other great upsides that come from volunteering, such as the sense of purpose, giving back to the community. So there's multiple, great benefits that come from it. And if you might get a job, you might not. That seems to have always been your take.
I like that. I'm gonna have to start using that. So, yeah.
Let's talk about a subject that you were correct when you recommended that we talk about this. There is a big gap in information on this, and it's a very important subject, which is people who are searching for jobs while pregnant. There for some reason there is not a lot of good resources on this. So let's create some good resources on this. What should people who are interviewing while pregnant do?
It's a great question, and I share this because I now feel comfortable sharing it, but also because when I was thinking about having children, pregnant, I was looking for resources out there to help me, and I couldn't find a lot. And it's something too where, like with your job search, you can ask your parents or your, a group who's already gone through that stage of life before, and yet things have changed a lot. Things have changed a lot since my mom had me, and what her job experience was like at that time. So, I would say I remember planning my job searches around having children. I have 2 children, and remember thinking with my first job that, okay, I love working here, but I want to find a new job that is more fulfilling and more aligned with the type of work that I want to do in international education. And yet I didn't feel like I had the choice. And for my family, I didn't leave this job until I have had the baby. I was pregnant, and finished my leave, even my unpaid leave, because I wouldn't be eligible for a new job under FMLA until I'd worked somewhere a year. So for me, that was a big thing to navigate, and it kept me in a job, again, that I'm very blessed that I really liked the place I worked, but I wanted to be doing something different. It kept me in a job 1.5 years, 2 years beyond where I wanted to be, because I was pregnant. Also, interviewing while pregnant. I mean, there are laws, of course, that protect you. So on the surface, you're safe to interview while pregnant to get a job. And yet there's so many considerations. And I have interviewed while pregnant, and I did it because I was interested in the job, but also I was like, I'm curious about this from a career services perspective. What the students that I've worked with who have disclosed to me, like, yes, what do I do if I'm pregnant now? And should I start my job search now or when I have the baby? And there's not a black and white answer, because some jobs, and when I interviewed, I did disclose and it came up with, okay, when would you be available to start? And I said, well, I will share I'm expecting a child and I'm due this date, and so I wouldn't be able to start until this month. And I said, oh, and then I did make the interviewer uncomfortable sharing that. To me, I could have masked it and said point blank, I won't be able to start until this month, and then that would have ended the conversation, which maybe that's what I should have done. But you really have to feel it out. And this is a space where I would recommend having someone who works doing that informational interview months before you need it, and filling the well before you need to drink the water, and getting a feel for what that workplace is like, what their policies are. At 2U, for example, the current policy is actually you are eligible for leave after 9 months. So it's not a 12-month FMLA requirement. And so that's something I didn't know, and that changed, I think, since I started. I think that's really generous and a great policy, so that if someone were to interview while pregnant, they would still be eligible for, now 2U has very generously, we have fully paid leave for the 3 months. And so it's just something that you have to consider, and you really have to ask those questions. And it's not clear on the career pages, okay, you have a parental leave policy. What does that mean? Does it mean like that you get 2 weeks paid leave, and then you can take short-term disability? Does it, so those things are not clear. And I'm sure there's some great aggregate website out there that we need to, dig up and try and find but again, this is something where you'll see websites and they'll say, here are the top companies with the best leave. Okay, that's Airbnb, Uber, Facebook. Like, what about people who aren't working at these top Fortune 500, Fortune 100 companies, and are having to navigate this. And I think, 20% of women have any form of paid leave at all in the United States. It's a very low number. We'll have to, there's definitely an article or report out there on it. So it's something I do feel passionately about, because I was blessed to take the 4 months unpaid leave because I worked in Washington, D.C., which the FMLA is 4 months. But for most states, it's even just 3 months. If you meet all of the questions, for a company with over 50 people, you work at least 1 year, and you're only paid a job in the company, not your job. So there's a lot to consider, finding folks, who have been in that situation before. And I've talked about things related to parent, like being pregnant at work, and I've thought that I'm sharing this message with just women. And yet I've had people come up to me, men, who have said, you know what, I had never even thought about that. And my wife and I are expecting a child. And, thank you for sharing. Now I feel like I have more of an appreciation of what she's going through at work, or what she's thinking of. And that cognitive load, right, that you hear we're carrying, and that people, or maybe men, maybe other women who haven't had children, or aren't thinking about that, just it's not on their mind. Yeah.
Interesting. So you pointed out that it is in fact a legally protected class, but you also pointed out that that's maybe a surface deep. Do you have any examples, either from people that you've talked to, or from yourself, of bias against pregnant women interviewing, either explicit or implicit?
Well, it's not even just while interviewing too. You need to let your boss know at some point, or technically you don't have to, but ultimately you're going to have to plan for your leave. I think you are legally protected that you wouldn't have to tell somebody, but you do need to let HR know to get the short-term disability forms. So this is somewhere as well. I had one boss when I had one of my children who, when I told him I was expecting, like, he had tears in his eyes, and he was so happy for me. He had just had his first child, and it was like, I will never forget that moment of walking into his office and just how embraced I felt. So I had that experience. And then I had another experience where, they didn't have children, and they had never had an employee have a child before. And it was, it was an awkward moment. And then the onus was on me to navigate this process of, like, okay, well, what are the next steps of, I am going on leave. There's just things to consider there of that you might not necessarily want to when you're thinking about a child growing in your body. And then interviewing while pregnant, considerations to have. You just need to be ready to really think about, like, okay, when can I start this job realistically? And that's going to depend on the industry that you're working in, right? Like, sometimes for government jobs, you're applying and it can be a 4 to 6 month interview process. So other jobs where, like when I applied here and I had a 3-week interview process from, applying to getting the job. That's not the case for all positions, but that's, again, somewhere where doing an informational interview is going to give you insight to, like, typically how long does it, not just to hire at this job, but in that at this company, but in that department, because that can give you a better idea when the time comes of, okay, what are the expectations around when this job would start? And then you have to, I think I've read things about, you think you could start a job, like, okay, I can start a job 2 months after I have the baby, or I'll do it 1 month, and then you get into the job and it's like, I have a newborn, I'm learning a new position. There's a lot more to navigate. So being realistic with yourself, and also at the same time, I say that, and that it's such a privilege to even be able to take, in the United States, that time off. So.
This might be a leading question, but do you think that it's a coincidence that a lot of these companies you talked about, they're kind of the top Fortune 100, Fortune 500 companies, top 20%, also seem to offer this leave? Do you think it might be a coincidence that the companies that offer good family leave time also tend to do very well?
Well, that's an interesting question. I'm not sure on the causality, the chicken or the egg of what that means. I do know that companies are using it as a way to, recognizing the value that employees who feel valued will want to come it will stay. And so I love reading Sally Krawcheck's pieces about, investing in parental leave is not just an altruistic policy. It drives employee engagement, and you think it's a return on your investment. Because if I am working for a company where I don't have good leave, I come back and I don't feel valued. I feel like I've been rushed into it. I don't have a flexible leave policy. If I have the choice to go to another employer who's going to value my skills, I would leave. And then the cost of retraining an employee and the time to get them back up to speed, it's been proven that it's not in the interest of a company. I'm interested to see. I know the U.S. has just changed the policy. I think it goes into effect October 1st. That of mandated, paid leave for government employees. So that'll be interesting to see how that incentivizes private sector companies to follow suit who don't already have those leave policies in place.
Yeah, I think the discussion ties in more broadly to the discussion of work-life balance. How important do you recommend, when people are coming to you for career coaching, how important do you recommend it is for people to pursue very strict work-life balance?
Well, I heard Adam Grant in a podcast talk about work-life rhythm, which does sound a little bit more in line with what I think people experience today, and the flexibility of employers recognizing, and I do fear, like, my boss and my employer recognize I have a life outside of my work, and that I'm not expected to be, at home, leave the office, be home, be online, answer to G chats, answer emails. So I personally have put those, that boundary in my life, because I go home, I do have 2 children, I have my partner that I want to be present for, and yet, if it's needed, I will hop on a call if we have a webinar or something that's at night, because I know my employer is willing to have that flexibility with me when I need to come in half an hour late. I've got to drop my child off for a doctor's appointment or take them there. And so it's like Adam Grant says too, it's, givers and takers. And that applies, I think, for the employer and employee. So that is how I've found my own work-life rhythm or balance. But there's so many folks out there who talk more eloquently about it. But I think it's just having a mentality of, I want to bring my best to all of the things that I'm doing. And so I need to give myself grace, and I hope my employer will give me grace as well.
So one of your passions is supporting women-run businesses. Is there something that people can be doing on a day-to-day basis to help support this?
Well, you can find women-run businesses that you like. And I know, again, I'll try and dig up some of the lists that I've seen where, you can see, find them in your area. And I think, let's see. So I like to buy from women-run businesses. For me, it fills my cup. Like, I feel motivated after speaking with these women entrepreneurs. And it makes me feel good to support their business, and then it also energizes me that I think maybe one day I want to start my own business. I feel like I'm learning from them and what they're doing.
Are there things we can do to help promote more female entrepreneurs?
Buy from them. And these are women I love following. Again, Sally Krawcheck. I am going to a women's summit in a couple weeks, Alt Summit, where it's for women entrepreneurs and creatives. So you can find, even if you don't attend these conferences that are women focused, you can go to their speaker page and find out, okay, who are the people who are presenting here that again, I do go down social media rabbit holes, because I see the content that they're putting out, and then typically they're elevating the voices of other women entrepreneurs. For me, I believe that, what is the saying? Something about our lights can both shine bright. Like, your candle lights my candle, and then we can both have lit candles. Something. And I think the women who are successful and people who are successful don't keep it for themselves. They would lift up others in their own rise. Then I do know it's JFK that rising tide lifts all boats. I got to tie back in the Peace Corps, right? I enjoy seeing on social media folks. Catherine Minshew from the Muse, she's always posting other women-run businesses.
That's great. That's great. We're running out of time here, so I'm wondering if there's any topics that you'd like to talk about that we didn't get to.
I think you covered it. We covered it.
That's
Yeah,
what I
I
like to
feel
hear.
good.
I guess kind of a
Yeah.
parting question I would have would be, obviously you're career coach and you talk to a lot of people who are looking for advice. If you could kind of distill, one common piece of advice that would most be helpful to most people, what would that piece of advice be?
Be curious. And I think that it's like, be curious with yourself. What are you interested in? What do you really want to be doing? Not just the job title or the daily tasks, but like what's your larger purpose? What do you want to be working toward? I don't necessarily ascribe or subscribe to the find your passion. You do need to. I have some folks who will say to me, friends often, or anybody, I'll do anything. I'll do any job I want. I just want to work at that company, and I would do anything. It's like, well, you really be curious about what specifically would you want to do. And then, like I shared, around informational interviews and networking, you really need to show interest in others so that it'll come across quickly if it's surface level and you're like, I just want to connect with Garrett because I know he's going to connect me to other people, and you'd feel that quickly. People are detectors of that kind of energy, I think. So yeah.
Very good, very good. Anything that you want to plug? Any kind of articles you're writing or any exciting features at 2U or anything?
Well, I just posted an article on LinkedIn about how I think a job search can be like losing a tooth as an adult, because I had a tooth come out of my mouth the other day and had to get it urgently, a crown, put back in. So please, connect on LinkedIn. I'll push my own LinkedIn page. And yeah.
Good. There's a little good. There's a little lag there in the video, but it sounds like LinkedIn. So I'll make sure to include your LinkedIn link in the show notes so people can follow you that way.
Sounds great.
Well, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.